Previously on Dealing with Dinosaurs on Noah's Ark, we dealt with several logistical questions surrounding the possible number and size of the dinosaurs and other creatures on board the Ark, as well as the feasibility of feeding these creatures throughout their year-long voyage. Join us now as we unpack several more messy objections that often come up when discussing the idea of dinosaurs on board the great ship, such as how could only 8 people have possibly cared for 7,000 animals' food, water, and waste management over the course of a year? In Part 5 of Dealing with Dinosaurs on Noah's Ark. Despite the objections often heard, the facts of the matter are that studies of non-mechanized animal care indicate that it's easily believable that just a few adults could have cared for 7,000 creatures. Modern Bible skeptics often love to scoff at the possibility that a single family could coordinate such a huge undertaking, citing supposed enormous difficulties such as how could you feed so many animals every day? Where would you put all their waste? And how could you provide and replenish their water? But the answer is simply the old adage, don't work harder, work smarter. And the biggest key in doing that for Noah's family would have been to prepare systems beforehand while building and loading the ark so as to avoid walking around unnecessarily once they were underway. And what do I mean by that? Well, simple ideas like spreading out and storing food and water near each animal beforehand, or even better, piping gravity-fed drinking water into troughs, just as the Chinese have used bamboo pipes for this purpose for thousands of years, would make sense. And using some sort of self-feeders, as is commonly done for birds, would have been essential and relatively easy to set up and operate. Skeptics often point to animals that today require special care or diets as impossibilities for Noah's Ark being possible. But this assumes that these animals were likewise specialized at the time of the flood. But that may not have been the case in the ancestral kinds that were taken on the Ark. And as we saw in Part 4, when we discussed plant-eating crocodiles, creatures can often subsist on food uncommon to their normal preferences in many cases. And even if there were some special case food requirement scenarios for a few specific kinds of animals, this wouldn't have been an overwhelming amount of extra work for Noah's family to have dealt with. It would just make sense, with Noah being over 500 years in age, that he would have knowledge to be able to incorporate automatic feeding systems that only had to be refilled occasionally using simple tools like wheelbarrows, pitchforks, and food scoops to do so. Rainwater collected from gutters built into the roof would provide ongoing refills for water cisterns, which would reduce the need for water storage considerably. But the sheer size of the ark eliminates that as a necessity, although it would simply make sense that they would have done so. The most likely solution would have been a combination of storage and rainwater collection. Now, some might wonder how larger creatures like some of the dinosaurs would have dealt with being cooped up without a lot of exercise for that long. However, the dim lighting in the ark would have had a positive impact on many reptiles and amphibians, making them largely inactive. Inactive crocodiles, for instance, are known to last up to 3 years without a meal. And although many larger animals may have needed to get out and stretch occasionally, Noah could have come up with some practical solutions that wouldn't require too much extra space, such as having an open area where larger animals could be channeled via a system of gates, allowing them to exercise on a rotation schedule. In the original Jurassic Park movie, there's a memorable moment where the character of Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by actor Jeff Goldblum, expresses astonishment when he comes upon a large mound of collected dinosaur droppings. And it emphasized the somewhat humorous and obvious conclusion that many Bible critics regularly throw out against the historical account, which is how could Noah and company possibly have dealt with the ark's leading export, manure and animal urine? And it's a good question when you think about it, as there would certainly have been a whole bunch of potential problems piling up over their year-long voyage if it couldn't have been handled properly. One of which would have been a possible buildup of methane gas, something that any firefighter will tell you is nothing to take lightly. Skeptics will often tout statistics such as the fact that just one adult elephant defecates about 12 to 15 times and can produce in excess of 100 kilograms or 220 pounds of dung per day. This means over the span of a year, an elephant will produce over 40 tons of dung. They mock the idea of Noah's Ark being turned into a massive floating outhouse when considering the idea of massive sauropods and other huge dinosaurs being on board. Now, firstly, we must remember the likelihood of juvenile or sub-adult representatives of larger animals such as dinosaurs, elephants, rhinos, etc. having been on board, which would of course mean far less solid waste than skeptics like to project. Remember, the end goal of bringing them on board the Ark was to keep them alive and to ensure that they would be fruitful and multiply. So, bringing full-size dinosaurs that only had a few years left or were past their reproductive prime seems illogical. When calculating the entirety of the waste produced by the entire group of onboard contributors, this would bring the amount down to perhaps 12 or so tons in total per day, which is still a huge amount of work if it required people for direct disposal or neutralization. But of course, the key to keeping the enclosures largely waste-free was to avoid the need for Noah and his family themselves to do all of the work, and to get the animals and the Ark's design to do it for them. In this regard, there could have been slatted floors and animals could have simply trampled their waste and soil bedding into pits below, whose angled floors possibly dropped the waste out into the ocean. Alternatively, sloped floors in other animal enclosures could have allowed the waste to flow into large central gutters, again allowing gravity to do most of the collective work, while Noah's family could have then dumped this overboard without an excessive expenditure of manpower. Small animals such as birds could have multiple levels in their enclosures, and waste could have been simply accumulated at the bottom of each and collected and disposed of periodically. As per the urine, the same principles apply. Noah could have built slatted or grooved floors beneath some of the cages, perhaps with gutters, to help automate the process of waste collection. Bamboo would have again been a practical choice because it resists urine's corrosive effects and so could have been used to pipe away liquid waste. Liquid and solid waste could also have been emptied into a cavity inside the ship that opened into the ocean, called a moonpool. Although the concept has been around a long time, it wasn't used much until recently with the arrival of drill ships designed for oil exploration. But today, it's now even been incorporated into modern ships such as the RRS Sir David Attenborough. To understand how a moonpool operates, picture a ship with a hole in the bottom of the hull and a wall surrounding the hole all the way up through to the top deck. Water won't enter into the ship because it's contained inside the moonpool's walls, moving up and down like a piston as the ship rides the waves. And there are several sound engineering reasons to believe Noah may have included such a feature, as firstly, it would help relieve hull stress as the vessel crested a wave. Second, the rising and falling water within the moonpool could be used to draw in fresh and also extract stale air. And thirdly, recent research has shown that moonpools induce resistance to movement. For Noah's ship, this may have dampened wave motion, making the voyage more comfortable for all aboard. The danger of toxic or explosive manure gases, such as methane, would be alleviated by the constant movement of the Ark, which would have allowed manure gases to be constantly released. Methane, which is half the density of air, would quickly find its way out the window at the top of the Ark. Now, the Bible's not specific as to the kind and size of the window on the Ark. However, it's reasonable to believe that even one relatively small window would have adequately ventilated the entire Ark. Of course, if there was a window running around the entire top center section, which the biblical description allows for, all occupants would have been even more comfortable. It's also interesting to note that the convective movement of air, driven by temperature differences between the warm-blooded animals and the cold interior surfaces, would have been significant enough to drive the flow of air. Plus, wind blowing into the window would have enhanced the ventilation further. So there's no reason to believe that the levels of these gases within the Ark would have even remotely approached hazardous levels. And while the problem of manure odor may at first thought seem inconceivable to us sanitized and so-called more civilized modern homeowners, we should remember that having barns separate from human living quarters is a relatively recent development. Throughout most of human history, humans lived together with their farm animals regularly. As the average dinosaur is about the size of a bison, and the estimated number of dinosaur kinds, of which only a pair of each was brought, was approximately 80 to 85, it means somewhere around a maximum of 170 dinosaurs were taken on board the Ark. Therefore, the Ark had adequate space for every kind of dinosaur, particularly if God sent sub-adults to Noah. For example, the average 24 by 7 foot cattle trailer can safely haul a maximum of 11 1,200-pound cows. If cattle were transported with a common semi-truck trailer measuring 53 feet long and 8.5 feet wide, an average of 28 such animals could be safely hauled. That means, even assuming the maximum number of dinosaur kinds, only 6 of the 450 semi-truck trailer storage capacity for a royal cubit-sized Ark would be needed for the dinosaurs. The fact is, when you consider the density of animals on the Ark, compared to the volume of enclosed space, it was actually much less than we find in some modern mass animal housing used to keep stock that are raised for food, such as chicken farms, which often require no special mechanical ventilation. So while the voyage of the Ark may not have been comfortable or easy, it was certainly doable, even with dinosaurs on board, because God always keeps his word. Noah accomplished everything God had commanded because Noah knew his Creator had made a promise to save both him and his household and deliver them into a completely new environment after the floodwaters had subsided. And that leads to even more questions often asked about Noah's Ark and the Great Flood that we often hear regarding how the creatures would have been able to survive in the devastated environmental landscape they would have walked off the Ark into. Join us next time where we'll ask, how could dinosaurs have survived after leaving Noah's Ark? And deal with several other questions concerning the aftermath of the Great Flood in Part 6 of Dealing with Dinosaurs on Noah's Ark.